Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Changing Tides podcast. In each episode, we invite guests to have honest conversations about their mental health journeys with the goal of destigmatizing mental health within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Due to the nature of the podcast, we'll be discussing a variety of mental health topics and possibly triggering experiences. While we and the majority of our guests are not trained professionals, we encourage you to practice self-care while listening and seek professional guidance if you or a loved one is in need of support. With that said, let's start the episode.
Hey everyone, my name is Ken Fong, and I would say that my mental health journey has been fast and slow and fast and slow.
Hello and welcome back to the Changing Tides podcast. My name is Matthew Yonemura and I am the host of this show. Thank you so much to everyone that's been tuning in or tuning in for the first time. Support of any kind is always welcome. So even if you pop in, pop out, it's all good. As I've probably said in past episodes, at this point, I don't remember how often or what I say because I kind of do these intros off the cuff, which is why you see so many edits and cuts in them. But this has been a big year for Changing Tides, and it's going to continue to be because we have a lot of exciting developments going right now. A lot of stuff that I'm really excited to announce, but for now, I'm going to keep it quiet and locked away because we will do official announcements. I don't know when they'll be announced in terms of when I'm recording this because I recorded this in the past and not like the day before this episode comes out. So maybe it's already been announced. I don't know. But anyway, forget all this. Let me just introduce the guest of this podcast, of this episode. You'll see if you're watching on YouTube that he has quite the setup, but there were some technical difficulties. So although he has a great setup in front of him with a microphone and everything, we didn't have that audio. So he has great audio equipment, so but it's using the Zoom built-in audio for him. But this great guest, he had me on his podcast, Asian America, the Ken Fong podcast, and once you guess it, Ken Fong is his name. Great guest. For someone that's not religious, such as myself, he really enlightened me on the religious experience and how it actually can go hand in hand with mental health. Whereas for me, as someone who doesn't know, I wouldn't have thought that religion and mental health can go hand in hand. So I already said his name, might as well introduce the interview now. Here's the interview that I had with Ken Fong. So Ken Fong, thank you so much for coming on to the CT podcast after you were kind enough to have me as a guest on your show. Before I get into my questions, I want to hear more about fast, slow, fast, slow. We've heard ups and downs, but I've never heard fast, slow. So I'd love to hear why you describe it as so.
Okay, well, first I have to make an honest confession to you, Matthew, that I just hate being the typical person.
Okay.
And so I'm guessing most people said up and down. And so I come up with fast and slow.
I love it.
Got you intrigued.
Yeah.
I would say slow. The first slow stage is most of my life up until my mid-30s, late 30s, where I'm not really paying that much attention to my mental health because there wasn't a lot causing me to pay attention. And then in my late 30s, our church was going through an unnamed split. Okay. And it's a historically Asian American church and specifically Japanese Americans, so a lot more face-saving instincts there. And so, we're just like, oh, well, this is just kind of a friendly split, but there's nothing bloody about it. But my own experience was this was very personal. And because no one would address what was the reasons for the split and how people were making their choices, it was like maddening. And so I sought out a therapist and we spent a good 7 months together. And I went so far beyond my presenting questions because he's a good therapist, right? It was like understanding my original pain and my relationship to my parents. So after that was done, then we formally went through the split, and I got to tell you, so uh, that was the fast part, where
Mm-hmm.
I every week I did this deep investment in understanding myself and why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And then I was able to slow down in a different way after I came through the 7 months, because now we're actually going through all of this, right? And I'm able to say, oh, I understand why I'm thinking that. I don't have to think that,
Hmm.
right? Or, yeah, you can have that opinion of me, but that doesn't mean it's true,
Right.
right? And I would say for the next 25 years, when I was leading that portion of the church, and even taking on the LGBTQ challenge and all of that, those 7 months spent with my therapist, I basically was in, standing on his shoulders, if you will.
Mm.
I was a much better leader. I think I was a much healthier human being. And I've carried that forward into my retirement.
Hmm. So, Ken, with that, there's so much I want to talk about. But before then, elephant in the room, you're the oldest guest we've had on the podcast. Um, and over email, you say, let's look at it as the wisest, which I agree with. You are the wisest as well, but
Not necessarily the smartest, not necessarily the smartest. It just wisdom should come with experience.
right. And from you have me on your podcast, and from this description, it's in and of itself, the like I could see that your experiences, you've learned from them, you've developed the wisdom, like it's true. But mental health wasn't something on our radar back then. I mean, it wasn't on my radar. I wasn't around.
Sure.
But the world, mental health wasn't discussed. So I want to know more about your experiences growing up before getting into everything else. So, literally back to the beginning.
Okay.
What was life like growing up as an Asian American in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, well, you're already giving me the benefit of the doubt because I was born in '54.
Well,
Yeah, but I will say this, Matthew. Given the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine and the threat of nuclear war and all of that, it's caused a lot of us to revisit the Cold War. And I grew up post atomic bomb dropping, Cold War.
Right.
So there was very much a sense of anxiety. I mean, we're doing atomic bomb drills in elementary school. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm guessing you didn't have to go through that.
No,
Right?
earthquake drills.
Yeah, right. So it's like, okay, if there's a atomic bomb siren warning, let's all get under our desks. Like, that's really going to help us.
I know.
So there's that in general. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, Vietnam War, Civil Rights Movement, there was just this upheaval of what has been, of what the traditions had been. The Watergate, right? The whole loss of trust in institution, in government, all those kind of things. Then you get micro and granular into my growing up. So my parents are both second generation. So according to Japanese counting, their parents were immigrants to America. My parents were born in America, bilingual, really poor command of bad Chinese. Right? And then me and my three siblings were third generation. And so without understanding the racism reaction to some of my parents' choices, my mother in particular made sure we didn't have to go to Chinese school.
Huh.
Okay. Because later on, my mother would say, oh, I grew up being made fun of because I was the immigrant kid of Chinese immigrant parents. And she would always add this part. She would say, because you could be anything you want because you're in America. So if you want to be president of the United States one day, then you can't speak English with an accent.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Now, I would also add that I had no idea until years later that both my mother and my father, how they parented us, had a lot to do with their own growing up experiences.
Right.
Right. So my dad lost his father when he was like 8 or 9 years old.
Oh,
so,
wow.
His immigrant mother, lost their business, and then she took to cleaning houses. And my 9-year-old dad is the man of the house.
Wow.
Right? He lost the rest of his childhood. He had like 3 paper routes. He worked in a slaughterhouse.
That's crazy.
And we used to think he told us those stories just because he wanted to make us feel lazy,
Huh.
right? But then when I think about my complaints growing up, especially as I took psych later on in college, like, my dad never tells me he loves me.
Hmm.
He just doesn't know how to be emotionally present. Well, hello.
Right.
It's like he didn't have that.
Right.
Right? He didn't have that. Okay. So later on, I came to appreciate that he had that. My mother, she actually was an abused child
Hmm.
of what I would say my maternal grandmother was an undiagnosed person with mental health issues, serious
Right.
mental health issues. Okay. And so it made my mother who she was. And then she ended up playing favorites because of who she was. And I was her favorite.
Oh,
And
wow.
then, and I was her oldest son. But I'll tell you this quick story. So my mother, because she was the only daughter and was abused by her mother, she was determined when she was pregnant for the first time that she was going to have a girl.
Mm.
Like she could control that. Okay. So when my sister popped out, who was smart, beautiful, and talented, oh my gosh, my mom was ready to relive her whole life through my sister.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And so when she was pregnant with me, and this is what's germane to our talking here, she was determined to have another girl.
Huh.
She only picked girls' names. Okay. And so her pediatrician, who was a white guy, he delivered a lot of Chinese babies. He knew they wanted sons. And so he goes, oh, Emily, you're gonna have a son.
Uh-huh.
And my mom was pissed.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, man.
So I'm telling you this because before I even came into the world, she was already preset in her mind not to bond with me
Huh.
because she didn't want me. She wanted another girl to relive her life again. But I was born a blue baby. I had the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck. And so as she was pushing me out, she was strangling me.
Oh, my.
Kind of Freudian.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So I was blue when I came out. So I was left in an incubator instead of being brought home. And then the doctor made her work with me for the first year to see if there was any kind of unseen brain damage. And that to me, in my religious terms, was God's grace in my life because it put my mom and me together
Huh.
when she didn't want to be with me.
Right.
And I ended up being her favorite.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, going back to something you were saying about, not having a Chinese accent, not going to Chinese school, did that play a role in how you saw being Asian American? Did it make you more proud? Did it make you kind of ashamed in a sense? Like what was your relationship with being an Asian American?
Love that question, Matthew. I definitely did not identify primarily with being Chinese. Okay. My in second grade, there was this red-haired, freckle-faced little girl named Patty McKinney, and she and I really liked each other.
Okay.
And in second grade, it means you just hit each other and you untie each other's shoelaces.
Right.
Okay. But we knew that, okay, even though we didn't know how to express that. And then one day, a couple of weeks into our relationship, she comes to school and she says, we can't get married. And I said, why? Not like I'd ever brought it up. And she says, because you're Chinese.
Huh.
Okay. And I kid you not, I can remember that moment as if it just happened, thinking, so I guess I'm not as American/white as I think I am, because my little girl here, she just flat out dropped me,
right,
simply because I'm not white.
Right.
And then I started thinking, and then mom's crazy because there's no way I'm going to be president of the United States. Yeah, so I definitely did not feel great about the Chinese part. Now, the rub is my father's mother. So remember, his dad died when he was like a little kid. So his mother and him were really tight. And she's this little village girl, like never went to school, couldn't read or write any language. And she lived in her then bachelor son's house behind the alley on the next street over from our house. So she was over at our house all the time.
Uh-huh.
And I loved her. But when my school friends would come over, especially if they weren't Asian,
right,
I was ashamed of my grandmother.
Huh.
because she smelled like dried mushrooms
Right.
and tiger balm ointment,
Right.
right? And it's just like, oh man, just her being in my house, it's blowing my cover.
Right.
Yeah. So I struggled for a long time with the Chinese part. I'd be flipping through, let's say, National Geographic or Life magazine, and there'd be pictures of people in China, and I go, that is not me.
Oh my
I'm from
goodness.
California.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So real quick, what part of California did you grow up in?
Sacramento.
Okay. So I know like now there's a relatively large Asian American community, but what was it like for you?
There's like 35% of our high school was Chinese and
Okay.
Japanese. So it wasn't like I was the only Asian kid in the whole, school. It's that even on the continuum of Asianness, those who were more fobby were
Hmm.
definitely not the people that I wanted to hang out with. In fact, I
Interesting.
remember I remember in elementary school, there I am with my professional haircut and pants that cover my socks,
Uh-huh.
and some new kid would drop in fresh from the immigrant train, and the teacher would assume that I'm going to be nice to him because I'm Chinese too, and I'm
Right.
like, what is going on here? We are not going to be friends.
That's so interesting to hear because just the landscape now, like, I mean, for me growing up in elementary school, middle school, I was pretty proud of being Asian. I didn't know what it meant for sure to be Asian. I just knew that was my existence and I loved the food. But I never experienced that. So it's so, like, I can't imagine. You would have been like, I mean, you're cool now, but imagine you growing up in elementary school now. You'd be like, oh my god, like, what does Ken have for lunch? I gotta go steal
Yeah,
his
right.
food.
Yeah, right.
You
Yeah,
know?
bologna sandwich. Bologna sandwich. Well, I'll tell you. So the first time I started embracing being Asian slash Chinese
Uh huh.
was in high school when Bruce Lee was all the rage.
Oh,
Okay.
right.
So all of a sudden, I didn't do this, but so many of my male Asian peers were wearing kung fu slippers to school. Right.
Oh,
Okay. And everyone's kind of walking like martial arts.
yeah.
Right. That whole sort of thing. Now, I look back on it now, Matthew, and go, okay, that's also a stereotype,
Uh huh.
especially in the media. Asian males are so much more than unfeeling
Yeah.
martial artists who never get the girl. But man, we were starving at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. That was really huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say the level of self-hatred that I had was pretty deep. And I had no idea until later on when I was in graduate school studying this, that in some ways pursuing Christianity, kind of this Western model of what Christianity is supposed to be, it actually fueled my self-hatred.
Huh.
Because to be white is to be Christian,
Right.
and to be Christian is to read white authors and not
Right.
minority authors, certainly not Asian authors. They're too liberal,
Mm.
and all this kind of stuff. And so as I did a deep dive in this, I found out that this sociology professor, Dr. Rudy Busto, he actually had done a huge study on this. And he said, oh, isn't it interesting that in the 90s, so many of the campus Christian groups like InterVarsity, Campus Crusade, Navigators, they're busting at the seams with Asian Americans.
Right.
Now, why is that? Is that because they've somehow altered their approach so it's culturally attuned? He's like, no, they're doing the same thing. He says, I think it's because so many of those Asian Americans have such deep-seated self-hatred that they're kind of trading their Asian identity for a white born-again identity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I
So,
totally identify that that's what I was doing.
and that leads directly into my next question was, when did religion start playing a role in your life, and how has it now evolved over time?
I was brought to church literally in my mother's arms.
Hmm.
Okay, so First Chinese Baptist Church in Sacramento is where I grew up. It's the second oldest Baptist work among Chinese west of the Mississippi. It was started when, get ready for this, when Abraham Lincoln was president. That's how old this church is. Okay,
That's
it's
unbelievable.
insane. It's
Yeah.
insane. Okay,
Yeah.
so but all I knew is when I was going there, it was Cantonese, English. I didn't identify with the Cantonese; they were the minority part.
Mm.
But all my aunts, a lot of my Fong side aunts and uncles were there, my cousins. So it was very much kind of wrapped into a ball of, it's both religion and it's a Fong family thing to do.
Right.
It's also experience outside of school and general society where I experienced Asian cultural things. Like I'm sure you did this too. Like I grew up calling other adults auntie so-and-so, uncle so-and-so.
Of course.
Right.
I still don't know who's who's really blood.
Right.
I still don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that comes down to your birthday. They don't give you a present. They're not really your blood auntie or uncle. Yeah. So very much a part of that. Now, at the time, we didn't have the term evangelical. I don't even think we had the term fundamentalist, but we were just being taught what the white missionaries, taught our pastors, and we even had some white missionaries from China that were at our church. So I just grew up not believing in evolution. I grew up that being gay is a sin. I mean, all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I went away to college, and like most people, when you become a young adult, I started kind of thinking for myself and started expanding my friendship circles, and started thinking, gee, I grew up thinking if you're not Baptist, I mean, you could be Methodist, Matthew, and I'm already looking at you with suspicion. Like,
interesting.
Yeah, no, real Christians are Baptists. Okay, right. And so then I started having friends who are Methodist and Presbyterian and Buddhists and nothing. And I'm like, well, if what I was taught originally is true, then if heaven is real, it's going to be very sparsely populated. Right?
Right.
So I really started to wrestle with it. Plus, I was a life science major. Well, how do I continue to deny evolution when I'm taking all my life science classes?
Right.
Okay. So I graduated with all this tension inside, unresolved. And then after my first year in seminary, I think that's when I had a breakthrough. And I was like, you know what? I can't say that I know what's up. I grew up with this. This is what I'm comfortable with. Well, what if I grew up in Pakistan in a madrasa?
Right.
I mean, it's not like I went on this huge spiritual search, looked at all the great religions of the world, even a few minor ones, experienced everything, and then came to, no, it's like my mom brought me in her arms, and it was part of my culture. It was part of my surroundings. But now that I'm an adult, and then later on a pastor, do I still just kind of keep working off those fumes? Or do I start paying attention to the reality that I know to be true as an adult? And that kind of gets back to mental health. Because I think for a lot of folks, you've so compartmentalized in order to coexist in all these realms that you're not a congruent person. And I felt like, you know what? I can't, that takes too much energy. I need integration. I need congruency.
Mm-hmm. Your experience as a podcast host is really kicking in because you're leading me into every single question I want to ask you. Because bringing it back to mental health, how has the landscape changed over time? Like what was it like for you during this time, and how did you address it?
Oh, it wasn't addressed. I distinctly remember, not specific conversations, but I distinctly remember this pervasive sense of shame. Like if we heard on occasion that someone had a nervous breakdown, that was kind of what they said, right? Or they're depressed, or God forbid, they chose to take their life, right? Something like that. Or they have a gambling problem, or they have a drinking problem, those kinds of things. Oh, it was always surrounded with this pallor of shame. Like, what an awful thing for that person to do to their family.
Right.
Okay. So there's our Asian stuff, kicking in. We're very communitarian. No one's an individual. And so then I remember when I was taking molecular biology at Cal Berkeley, and I did not get the Krebs cycle. It made no sense to me. And I got like a D on the midterm. And I remember for the first time having my own feeling of, how in the world do I tell this to my parents? Not like they've ever overtly pressured me to be a doctor or something like that, but I just feel it. Like I'm letting everybody down. This isn't just my failure to grasp a concept or to study enough for the test. It's like now my whole family's going to feel, this takedown.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very oppressive. very, very oppressive. And I don't think I knew anyone that was going into mental health professions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's something we're seeing now. I mean, even still, there's a lack of um, Asian American therapists. Like there are a lot, but like when you think about the needs of the
Yeah.
Asian American community, it's still something that we're trying to wrap our heads around. Um, so with that in mind, though, when did your mental health journey begin, and how were you able to finally begin addressing things?
I would say, I mean, it's not a hard and fast start and
Right.
stop. Or I would say that shortly after I became a pastor, and in seminary, we had to study communication theory and how to counsel and that kind of stuff. And then people would start to come to see me as a pastor. In trying to put into practice what I learned, I began to realize a couple things. Number one, I'm not a therapist.
Mm.
Okay. Um, the funny part of that is in the beginning, I had so many people, I almost called them clients, so many people coming to see me from the church. Okay.
Yeah.
And I would turn to my wife of a couple of years and I go, man, I must be a really good counselor because look how many people. And she goes, or you're free.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And,
Yeah.
and I, as much as I hated hearing that, I heard the truth. I heard the truth in that because I said,
Yeah.
you know what? I think there's and this is another realization, there's a very important distinction between doing pastoral counseling and doing therapy. I
Yeah.
think those who are pastors, we are kind of the first attempt of someone who's seeking help. And I don't discount at all when someone reaches for the phone, types in a text message to a pastor and says, can I talk to you? Right? Because it takes a lot to get to that point. I think it's problematic if pastors think that they're therapists
Mm-hmm.
because we're not trained as therapists.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And one of the big differences is when someone comes to a pastor for pastoral counseling advice, okay, you don't go to a therapist for advice.
Right. Right.
But for spiritual counsel advice, you go to your pastor, and your pastor is not committed to see you for the next 7 months once a week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We don't have that kind of time, let
Right.
alone training. So I cut right to the chase. I'm like, okay, Matthew, you need to just quit gambling. Like, stop
Hey,
that. Yeah.
man.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good. You're sinning, right? So,
Yeah.
so realizing the limitations of my own training, I began to develop a little circle of trained licensed therapists, especially Asian American ones, that I would hand people off to.
Wow.
And people would first be, what, you don't want to talk to me anymore? I thought you were a caring person. I'm like, okay, let me explain. Like, the best thing I can do for you right now is to hand you off to someone who's a guide to take you in a direction that I don't know how.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now I got to warn you, they're not going to give you advice. They're not going to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Like I have. Okay. So I would say definitely the context of my work in the church, it showed me that there's a great need for people to talk about what they're dealing with, what they're feeling. And there's a place for pastors in this case to be kind of that first attempt, first experience. But then there's no substitute for having this still growing, as you alluded to earlier, still growing network of licensed therapists of all different dialects and languages,
Yeah.
right? Spiritual or not background, to receive people who go initially through the church door.
Mm-hmm. This is all so interesting for me to hear personally because, I myself did grow up in a religious household. So with that in mind, like some people, including myself, like we might see how, like in our convoluted way, because because I don't know, might see how religion might steer people away from being socially progressive or from mental health, because as you said, people might go to their church for their mental health needs or from whatever it might be. So, how did you find that balance of like this progressive view of therapy and its usage while balancing religion, because I don't think
Yeah.
that's, maybe I'm wrong. I could be entirely wrong. So I'd love for you to tell me how I'm wrong.
Well, especially because I'm so wise, Matthew. I will tell you. I'll tell
Okay,
you how you're wrong. Okay.
great.
Well, I would say this. Remember, I said earlier that I learned to compartmentalize.
Right.
Okay. And so I continue to compartmentalize this more what we now today call evangelical thinking point of
Mm,
view with a healthy view of therapy. Now, I have colleagues who are much more conservative theologically than I am, and they still compartmentalize. Some of them are still, they were on boards of counseling agencies, even though they still held this very, very conservative, non-affirming, anti-abortion, sort of
right.
mentality. As I said before, I was seeking to be integrated and congruent. And so as I began to be challenged by my experiences with people in therapy, with myself in therapy, with volunteering at a drug clinic for 20
Mm,
years, with people with real problems that Bible verses can't help,
mm,
okay,
right. Yeah.
then I began to read the Bible differently. I began to
Wow.
use a different lens and go, you know what? This has been here the whole time. Jesus is for the marginalized. Jesus is for the oppressed. Jesus speaks harshly to the self-righteous stuffed shirts. I'm like,
Right.
uh-oh, that's me.
Mm,
Okay. So very much so, it became kind of a spiritual deconstruction, reconstruction, where I go, all this time I'm saying I'm one of those faithful disciples following Jesus. It's like, no, if Jesus were here today, I would be one of those Pharisaical Jews wanting to crucify him because he's too dang liberal. He's
right.
too dang inclusive, right? He cares more about poor people than rich people, blah blah blah. Okay,
Right.
and he's not even valuing our traditions. Okay, so I actually kind of came back to my spiritual base with a different set of lenses
Mm,
that I would say maybe realizing just now talking to you that I got those lenses by going the therapeutic route. It's like, well, therapy is about healing and a wholeness.
right.
Okay. My old lenses provided by my Christian upbringing was not necessarily aiming at healing and wholeness.
Mm,
It was righteousness, purity, morality.
right.
Yeah. Us and them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's when you describe it in that way, it makes it so clear why that balance is possible.
Yeah.
But for some reason, there's just like that there's some people who can't see how progress could coincide with religion. But you make it very clear, and I'm so happy to hear it from
Yeah.
you. Um,
Well, even as clear as you think I am, and I like to think that I am, again, go back into psychology here,
mm,
Matthew, since we're talking about psychology.
right.
I think our brains are pretty simple. And so for some of my friends and old colleagues who still live in this compartmentalized world, and some of them don't even include legitimate counseling. It's all biblical counseling. Like unless you're using Bible verses in prayer, you're not helping people. Okay.
Right.
Um, I would say for them, the idea that they're supposed to change their theology based on insights gained from living with real people, hurting people, people I've hurt with my theology,
Mm,
that is so threatening. Okay. So on the one hand, shame, the sense of shame that even though I thought I was right and doing good all this time, the sense of shame that I've actually hurt people, maybe even harmed people, is so horrible that I won't go there.
mm,
Whereas I went there. Okay. It's like, I have to go there. Okay. Which I think is a very spiritual thing. And then the second thing is if I go there and I allow these experiences that come out of therapeutic healing and wholeness, and I change my theology, I'm probably going to lose my job. I'm definitely going to lose my professional status in my little Christian group, right? So on and so forth. And I had to go through that too. And there are places that I used to be on the A list, to speak at their conference and stuff. No one calls me anymore. Okay.
right.
And the old me would have really been bothered by that because my sense of worth came from people's affirmation and invitation. The newer me, I'm a work in progress, right? The newer me
Right.
is just like, you know what? I understand why you don't want me to talk. In fact, I don't think I want to talk at your conference because you'd be, it'd just be oil and water.
Mm,
Okay, so this is actually a good thing. Okay, and yet my worth is still the same.
right.
It doesn't rise and fall based on people's opinion of me, and it's grounded in who I believe I am as a creation of God, and then who everybody else is a creation of God. So it's not just limited to me. So if I wasn't able to do that, and I know a lot of my colleagues have not, then they can't make that bridge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's. I think you should give yourself a lot of credit because as wise as you are, as many lived experiences as you've had, you continue to realize that you're a work in progress. A lot of people, even me at 23 years old, I'm like, oh, I've had so many experiences. I know I know who I am, and I am correct. I am right. My viewpoint is the correct one. So, I mean, I, I, I don't know if there's an answer that you could give because I couldn't give you an answer when you asked me like on your podcast like why do people my age think we could just do whatever we
Yeah,
want.
yeah.
But I'm curious like how do you continue to be able to see yourself as someone who could continue to grow even though you've done so much of growing already?
Love that question. Uh, I can't remember who, but someone shared a simple illustration with me that I think is the root of my constant curiosity.
Uh-huh.
So they said, if all knowledge, all truth, aside from religion, whatever, just truth with a capital T, was contained in this one big circle, okay, what shape and what size in that circle would be the truth that you know for a fact to be true, you personally? Okay, so if this is a pizza, how big is your slice?
Right.
Okay, now I think most of us would be humble enough to go, if we're talking about all truth in all of the universe, even truth, 1,000 years from now, my slice is pretty thin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, pretty thin slice. Okay, second question. Next to that slice that represents all the truth that you know, how big is a slice of truth where you know for a fact you don't know?
Hmm.
Okay, so like, okay, Matthew, if you asked me to direct a movie, like with your trade, I could tell you very honestly, very plainly, I don't know how to do that.
Oh.
Okay, if you asked me to fix your car, I would tell you I don't know how to do that. You asked me to transplant a liver, right? So compared to the first slice, how big is the second slice? I would have to honestly say way bigger than this first slice.
Right.
Okay, there's a lot more you and I don't know than what we know. Okay, now here's the kicker, man. The rest of that pizza, I don't even know what I don't know.
Huh.
Does
Huh.
that make sense? Right? Okay, when you draw this on a whiteboard or a blackboard and you see the
Right.
rest of the circle and you go, so how can I sit here, stand here, do a podcast, do a sermon, have a conversation with my best friend and talk like I know every freaking thing?
Yeah.
It's to me, it's wonderfully humbling. To other people raised with a different way that we know all truth and all, absolute truth, it's very humiliating.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think humility is not that far from humiliation.
Right.
Right?
No.
Right. And I think, but humility is a spiritual, a place we're supposed to get. Humiliation, that's still very selfish. I don't like that. You're making me feel like crap.
Uh-huh.
It's just like, no one's saying you're crap. It's just acknowledge your limitation.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense. That to me is always in the back of my mind. It's like, okay, I've spent a lot of time. I have a doctorate degree. I have a master's degree. There's so much I don't even know I don't know.
Yeah.
And, even the stuff in my own religion. Oh, so what's heaven like, Pastor Ken? Well, having been there, never. Right?
That's so funny to me that you say that. Like that, you're a pastor and you can't even, yeah, like you're, oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind with all of this. Because yeah, you're right. You're right. You know, you don't know what you don't know. I've lived my whole life in Redondo Beach, California, and I think I know it all. But who's to say that the person from Tennessee,
Yeah,
you know, their view is completely different than mine?
yeah. Because again, if you grew up in Pakistan in a madrasa,
Yeah,
that's totally good shit. Now,
yeah.
when my grandmother died, again, my dad's mother, the only grandparent I knew, the one who made me ashamed when my school friends came over, my grandmother died at like 94. And I remember thinking, and I was probably a freshman in college, still with my kind of conservative thinking, but curious brain. Like,
Mhm.
so the fact that grandma lived to 93 and she said she was a Christian. So is she going to be 93 for all eternity?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
like that sucks. Okay. You know, and then, and it's like whenever I die and go to heaven, at whatever age that is, it's not going to be 18 or 19. So how's grandma going to recognize me?
Right.
Right. And, but no one ever talked about that in church. So I
Yeah.
started talking about it. Okay. And I was
Nice.
like,
Yeah.
hey,
Interesting.
you know, it's just like, what if, I mean, if heaven is not necessarily a physical realm, but it's a dimensional realm. And what if initially we recognize each other the way we last saw each other? Because that's how we do it. But then after that, age and physical body, even race and gender
Yeah.
is nothing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And people are like, why are you even thinking about that? I'm like, because we're talking in
Yeah.
material terms about
Yeah.
things that are immaterial and we've never experienced it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was a fun pastor.
No, it sounds like because that's me as like I think there is a form of an afterlife, and I don't know why, but whenever I think of the age thing, or I genuinely think of it as a video game, and there's just like a gauge where you're allowed to pick. Like there's a lever for like height and weight, like
Oh,
height,
nice.
weight,
Get your
age.
avatar.
Yeah, I literally think of it as like I'll like whatever like day there is in the afterlife, if there's even like broken by time. We both sound like we're on some crazy drug right now, but we're not.
Yeah, right.
I'd like to think that each day I'm like, you know what? I want to be like 18 today. And then the next day I'll be 30. Who knows? But like, yeah, it's just a weird.
All right. Now, one difference between you and me, I tell you,
Uh,
Matthew, is I actually had an audience at formal situations. So I'm standing
right.
at gravesites in cemeteries talking like this.
Yeah.
Okay. My favorite thing to say at a gravesite ceremony is they say, I said, let's take a look at the hole in the ground. Right. Okay. Because it's the elephant in the room. Okay.
Right.
And it's just like, I just want us to think for a moment, like one day for sure, there's going to be another hole in the ground that they're going to lower our lifeless body into. Okay. So again, I'm just talking about obvious things
Right.
instead of all of these pontificate. Right. And I go, so what do you think about that?
Uh-huh.
Okay. What do you think about it? I said, let's just glance around the cemetery. And it's like we see all these headstones. Right. And it's just like, these were people too at one time. And I said, I'll tell you one thing, if there is something after we die, Matthew's version, whoever's version, like they know better than me.
Huh.
Because they already passed through this life.
Right.
Okay. I said, but for those of us who are Christians, let me just remind you of some of the things that the Bible says that we never really put two and two together. And I'm not saying this is a fact, but it's interesting. I said, so, the Apostle Paul talks about people who've died already, they've fallen asleep. I said, well, last night all of us went to sleep. Were you gripped in abject terror and fear the moment before you lost consciousness? It's just like, no, we just went to sleep. Okay.
Right.
And with the kind of the promise that we're just going to wake up like nothing's wrong the next morning. And I said, but there's coming a day when you're not going to wake up on earth the next morning. Okay. Mm-hmm. But I said, so what if it's kind of literally true like that dying is just losing consciousness and then you wake up in a different reality.
Right.
Okay. And I said, and what if in this reality, we are not limited, back to my grandma, we're not limited by all the things that we know to be true here. Age, location, gender, ethnicity, what have you. And here's the mind-blowing thing. I said, if there is an eternity, eternity is not the long time. Eternity in a biblical sense is a never-ending now. Because God doesn't get old, right? Right. So God doesn't have to wait to see what's going to happen. It's like God's outside of time. So I said, so when you and I go into that eternity, we too are outside of time. We are living in the ever-present now. And so people that are on earth that are still waiting for that day when they're going to die, who've been preceded by loved ones, from the loved one's perspective, and this is when everyone's mind just melts. From the loved one's perspective in heaven, let's say, they're already reunited with everybody who they're ever going to be because they don't have to wait. It's the ultimate barbershop, no waiting. Okay.
Right.
but everybody on earth is still marking time with clocks and calendars.
Yeah.
Right. And so I said, I'm not telling you anything that's not in the Bible. It's just that no one ever talks about it. Yeah. And I just find some comfort in that.
Yeah. And you know what? I actually am going to have to steal that note from you because a loved one of mine just lost someone in their family. And I'm going to have to share that because I think that's beautiful that you're already reunited in that realm.
That's why there's joy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I'm telling you, I am in the minutest minority of pastors, Christian pastors, who never say that. And I have people to this day who were at one of my random graveside services who will, see me someplace else and they'll like, man, I still remember what you said in those 5 minutes. I was just lost in thought, right? And it's like, I think we're so busy most of the time. It's good to be lost in thought and think about what might be.
Yeah.
And again, back to mental health, Matthew, I think that's healthy.
It is. I agree 1,000,000%. And yeah, I'm going to have to steal that because I think that's
Steal it away.
beautiful.
Steal away.
But, with all of this in mind and, the way that you have this open perspective, you've been so, you've said you've been so willing to gain and learn experiences. And it's clear that all of this is so clear through your podcast because of not only what you say, but the guests that you have. Can you discuss, with our audience, what your podcast is called, what it's about, give us your spiel.
Be happy to. It's called Asian America, the Ken Fong Podcast. And the reason my name is in the title is because back in 2015, when my director came to me and said we should do a podcast and put your name in it, he said we should have your name, not because you're a narcissist, but because you're already kind of a known figure. And so this is going to help people decide, to check it out. Okay. Yeah. So that's a brief explanation of that. Now, back in 2015, it turned out to be the year of the podcast. No one told us that.
Yeah.
But it was officially declared the year of the podcast. And we thought as these podcasts are popping into being, there's very few of them hosted by an Asian American, featuring Asian American guests telling their stories. Now, you might have Asian Americans who are doing generic things, right? But not that. And certainly, if they are doing like Angry Asian Man, they call us Bruce, that kind of stuff, they're not necessarily adding a light dusting of spirituality, which I'm able to do. So my director talked me into it. I said, I honestly don't even listen to podcasts. I know what they are. Yeah. And so he said, I'll do all the technical side. We have now been going week after week after week for this May will be 8 years.
Yeah.
I've won a couple of awards as one of the Asian American OGs of podcasting. And 2 years ago, I took over the whole thing. And I would say that we have a deserved reputation now as a platform for Asian Americans who are, I call them culture makers and culture shapers, to tell their stories. And especially people who they know I have a background as a pastor and they're gay, or they used to be a Christian, might even be a pastor's kid and they're an agnostic now. They know that I'm genuinely interested in hearing about their journey. I'm not trying to steer them,
Right.
to a certain conversion experience or what have you. And I think for that reason, it's really become a space that people see as unusual. It's like, wow, this guy, he was a Baptist minister, and he's during Pride Month, he has all these gay people on,
Right. Right.
and it's just like, oh, well, why aren't we doing that? A couple other things. I mean, we realized, I recently learned that we're in the top 1.5% of podcasts of the 27 million something podcasts out there.
Wow.
Yeah, as far as what people are listening to, and that doesn't mean I don't have to rely on my pension anymore. but it's just great to have an audience. I like saying that we're in every state but North and South Dakota, because there's no Asians there, and depending on the guests, we're in 100 countries.
Wow.
And so in a lot of ways, I feel like, I didn't tell you that when I was recording. I didn't want you to get nervous.
No.
Yeah.
I can hold my own.
You did. That was a great episode.
Thank you.
But I feel like it's, in some ways, it's given me a much wider influence and impact than I had as a pastor with a pulpit, right? And all of that. The other thing is the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA is in the process. In a couple of days, I'll be working with their IT person. They're going to be digitally archiving all of my episodes.
Wow.
And I'm going to put the Library of Congress tags on them, because they came to me and they said, the stories that you're collecting, the people that you're talking to, whether they're well known or not, this is invaluable, and we want future people to be able to access this.
Yeah.
And so that, of all the honors and awards that my show has gotten, that by far just blows my mind.
I couldn't agree. That's actually really beautiful in so many ways. Not only because of your reach and the way you said, like, you think it might even have more power than your job when you were a pastor, but you're right, the archiving of these conversations in a world where people may not realize some of these voices exist or their importance. It's beautiful, because while the Asian American movement and support behind the AAPI community is growing, you were there in 2015, and you've been here since, and that's unbelievable, because I mean, I don't know the age range of people who will listen to this episode specifically, but for people my age, you've had some crazy guests that people know. Like,
I just had Sean Liu on.
Sean Liu,
World of Dance choreographer, amazing dancer. He's Japanese, Chinese, Mongolian, but he's one of the co-stars in this hit new drama series on Fox called The Cleaning Lady.
Right.
And the running joke was, I've had the creator of the show, I've had the two stars, but when I told my daughter that I was going to get Sean Liu, she's like, oh no, he's too much of a social influencer. You'll never get him. Okay. And so I contacted the executive producer who was been on my show, and I said, connect me to Sean. 2 days later, he's like, hey man, what's up?
That's awesome. Okay, so I mean, you've had great guests, but I need to flex that you interviewed Kev Jumba.
Oh yeah.
Like people, and that was in a time when he was not present on social media. People
had wondered what happened to Kev Jumba. He was the first big, not just Asian American, first big YouTube star.
Yeah. And that when you told me that, like, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm on the same show as Kev Jumba.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were just talking before recording that you've had Danny Pudi on your show from Community, Abed.
Yeah.
Not only these big names like that people recognize, but you've had people who are also important to Asian American movements, to Asian American, advocacy. It's, with all of this, like, at the time of us recording right now, you've released 356 episodes.
That's right.
Through all those conversations, off the top of your head, what perspectives or lessons have you learned from your guests that are either directly about mental health or may translate to mental health?
Another great question.
I'm trying to learn from you.
You're very kind. You're very kind. I would say that maybe the last 3 years of the show, and this is going to sound contrary to what I said earlier, but I'm okay living with tension. I've learned to be a lot more curious about my guests. Some guests are harder to do that with. They may have been doing great things, but they're just a tough interview, right? And so then I end up talking more. Right? And I go, hey, I got interesting things to say, right? And I've got enough listeners and good friends. They're both, they'll see me the next week and go, dude, you talked too much that last episode. And I'm like, you know what? 100% agree. 100% agree. I said, but I was drowning. Right. It's just like they're giving me monosyllabic answers. So there's that. I really want to live out the practice that everybody is a story worth telling. And so as a host or filmmaker, I need to do the work necessary to get them to tell their story.
Right.
Okay. So for those who are authors, I'm reading their books before they come on. I'm finding out from people in the NPR world that that's laughable. Like, you actually are so naive. You think you have to watch that person's entire independent film. You actually, before you interview them, I'm like, well, if you don't, they're like, you read the first chapter, you read the last chapter, you look up a couple of reviews. I go, no, they can tell. Okay. And I think the creatives that have come on, I think they genuinely appreciate that I have my own take, my own experience with their work. It's just like, oh, here's this scene that really knocked me out, right? Just like, oh, yeah, you're not faking this. Okay. Yeah. So there's that curiosity is in the value of each person. Okay. And I will say too, that for my mental health, I have not really invited people on that in real life I wouldn't care to talk to. Okay. So in therapy, I put up a boundary on my podcast, right? And the people are like, well, to be fair and balanced, like Fox News, you need to have someone, represent. And I'm like, no, I don't.
No, you don't at all.
Yeah, I don't. Right.
Yeah.
And I love telling people I retired maybe a couple years sooner than I thought I was going to retire from pastoring, because I had almost 3 years of doing this podcast. And I go, oh my gosh, talk about mental health, Matthew. This is how I sound when no one can fire me. Like, there's no gun to my head. My entire adult life, working for churches, under denominations, being on boards, I know one of the first rules is you can't share what you actually personally think, because you now represent this organization, changing tides, whatever. I get it. I totally get it.
Yeah.
I said, but then with this podcast, well, if they don't like what I'm saying or what my guest is saying, conversation we're having, they can just turn it off. And again, it goes back to my sense of worth. I don't exist to make everybody happy, but I need to work on my own happiness. And at this stage in my life, why populate it with people that annoy me? Yeah,
100%. And and like people, I mean, I find it unbelievable that anyone would even gripe with that, because people might say I look at Joe Rogan, but look at Joe Rogan. Just because he has people who he disagrees with doesn't mean he also I won't get into it, but
he has a $200 million Spotify contract.
I know, so I mean, the money talks for itself. But
absolutely.
So I can't believe anyone would even throw that your way, because let's say with changing tides, let's say I had someone on who doesn't believe that depression is real. Who does that help?
Right. Why would you waste the airspace?
Yeah. So the goal of this podcast isn't to debate mental health. It's to shed light on it. So it's the same thing with your podcast. There's no need.
I hear you.
So
but see the old me, Matthew, would have lost sleep over that comment, that criticism.
Oh.
I got to talk about the other side. I can't let my bias show.
Yeah.
It's like, this is more than a bias. This is a conviction.
Yeah.
You know?
100%.
Yeah.
I have some quick fire fun questions for you, but
Ooh.
before then, do you have anything else you'd like to touch on?
Um, well, I hope that if folks are listening, that they do have the conclusion that the longer you live, you get to accumulate a little wisdom. It doesn't make you smarter, but there's lessons out there to be
Yeah.
learned, and that, hopefully that's what people get from this conversation.
Great. Great. So I have some quick ones just
Yeah.
to fire off. Uh, what is a skill you don't have but wish you did have?
Ooh. I kind of the way I got to this question before was, if I had a superpower, what would it be and why?
Uh-huh.
Right. So I don't know if that's more than a skill, but I think if I had a skill, let's say it's not a superpower, it would be to present information, facts, truth in such a convincing, compelling way that no matter where someone started, that they would come to, I don't want to say the right conclusions, but I would be able, especially if they started with different mindset, that I would be able to change their mind.
Uh-huh.
But I realize I don't have that power.
Hmm. That would be a superpower, though.
Oh yeah, it would be.
That would solve a lot of
Oh
problems.
yeah.
Off the top of your head, what are some of the more unique conversations you've had with your guests on your podcast?
Ooh, great question too. Um, the most downloaded episode was in the first year when uh, I broke my rule that I just told you, and we invited someone who's a world class atheist.
Huh.
Okay, and she's from Singapore. She's actually been on Joe Rogan recently,
Wow.
so she's really blown up. I'm sure she wouldn't come on my show now. Okay, but she was a little Judy Smarty from Singapore who was in a third year genetics doctoral uh, program at MIT when I invited her. And I think the reason why that's such a compelling conversation is she came completely ready to debate me.
Oh.
Okay. And I disarmed her within the first 5 minutes by saying, just full disclosure, I was a life science major at Berkeley.
Huh.
And she's like, what? Christians can believe science?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. I go, again, full honesty here. In the early days, I was a young earth creationist. I didn't fully buy into this, but I've changed my mind.
Huh.
And then Christians can change their mind. Right. So that was a really interesting conversation. And I think, and she could tell that I wasn't there to make her look bad or sound bad. I just said, okay, help me understand, as someone who doesn't believe in any kind of higher power, how do you come up with what's right and wrong?
Hmm. Huh.
I'm not asking that to be an asshole.
Right.
It's just like, so if I just took your laptop and I said, well, according to me, because I'm an atheist too, all things in the world belong to me. You're just temporarily holding on to it. What right do you have to get upset with me or to call the police?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so that was interesting. And at the end, she said, you know what? I have to tell you, my camp doesn't know people like you exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so she went on, in those days, we'd put the episode up next week. She went on all over social media and says, hey, everyone, atheists out there, you got to listen to this amazing conversation with the wonderful Reverend Fong, because we didn't know this subset of people exists.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. So that by far, huge, stands out to me. There's another episode during Pride Month several years ago where I had on these two doctors. They're married to each other. They met in med school. When they met and got married, the husband was a he and the wife was a she. And after 3 kids, the husband came out as trans. And the wife, the original wife, was raised in a small conservative Chinese church in the Midwest. So it doesn't get more enclave than that. And yet she stayed in the marriage.
Wow.
And so to me, and now she's like the LGBT advocate for Kaiser South.
Wow.
So I said, you know what? Both of you have gone through a transition that blows my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, right? I mean, now they look like a lesbian couple.
Uh-huh.
But I asked the original wife. I said, Joyce, how how did you stay in this? She says, number
Uh-huh.
one, as a medical doctor, I understand gender dysmorphia.
Mm.
So I know what it is, and I know how it's treated. And it also explains why I felt like my husband was just disappearing. He was dissolving in front of me. Okay. But second of all, because of my conservative upbringing, we took a sacred vow of matrimony in sickness or in health, for better, for worse, until death do we part. And so I vowed before God to stay in this relationship.
Yeah.
I'm like, gee, that's one of the first times I've heard a upside to being conservative. You know, yeah. So
Oh.
that was just an amazing experience.
Yeah.
Just hearing all of that. So those are the
Yeah.
two that really come to mind.
I'm gonna have to email you after this to make sure we link them.
Oh
Well,
yeah,
like your whole show, but specifically some of those because
sure.
that's awesome. Um, if you could invite 5 people to dinner, dead or alive, who would they be?
Ooh. Well, if they're dead, they're not going to eat anything.
Oh my goodness.
I'm trying to think how much food to make.
Oh man.
I'm telling you, my mind is this weird porous thing. I think I would want to invite Gandhi.
Okay.
And again, he's probably not really going to eat very much, but
Right.
I think even though he wasn't a Christian, he based his whole nonviolent thing on the teaching and the person of Christ,
Huh.
and just how he was able to contain his own religion and spirituality, and at the same time benefit from this other teaching. Right? I think that's fascinating. Since Ron Gandhi, I think MLK Jr. would be interesting. As a fellow Baptist minister, I would want to ask him some of the things not normally discussed about him. Like, so dude, you were cheating on Coretta.
Mm.
It's like, so I'm not here to judge you.
Right.
Did you ever think that your own proclivities could undercut the movement?
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's like, what was so worth that risk? Okay. Let's see, that's 2 guys. Is there a woman in there? Today, I would love to talk to Suni Lee,
Mm.
the Hmong American gymnast who won the gold
Right.
medal. I just, first of all, to hear her experience as a Hmong, her experience also with racism, anti-Asian racism before and after the games. The fact that when she thanked the Hmong community for helping pay for her coaching and stuff, and then she was criticized for not thanking America. Like,
Yeah.
really? How many
Yeah.
white American athletes were criticized for not thanking America? She's American, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would love to, hear at such a young age, what that's
Right.
all about. I think Michaela Schifrin, since the Winter Olympics just ended, she was supposed to potentially win 5 gold medals in skiing, and she didn't win any. And
Huh.
she skied off the course on 2 of her two of her favorite things. Just how mentally is she coping with disappointing so many people? Right? How does she go
Right.
forward with her life? If her sponsors are changing their tune,
Oh yeah.
yeah, that'd be really interesting. And then, I'd take Nathan Chen in a heartbeat, but I would love to talk to Victor Joe. Victor was he was also on the U.S. team. He's from the Bay Area, but he tested positive for COVID just before the men's individual competition. And so 4 years of training, of living in like a monk in isolation to not get COVID.
Right.
He still gets COVID. I love to pick his brain. And it's like, man, how you deal with that? It's forces beyond your control in spite of all your best efforts, and to give it's over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. That sounds like a very interesting dinner.
Yeah. I'll invite you too, Matthew.
I'll be one of the waiters.
Yeah.
What would the title of your autobiography be?
What would my autobiography be? maybe this is how I sound without a gun to my head.
Well, that could go in all types of directions.
I know. But
Wow.
I think people in the last dozen years of my pastoring, they really begin, those who stuck around, they really
Uh-huh.
begin to value my authenticity and my frankness and my humanity. And so I think they would understand why I would give it that title.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I from this conversation, I get it. But I was just like out the gates.
Yeah, I know.
Then finally, not so much question, but please plug your podcast one more time, where to find it, and anything you might have coming up, any interesting guests, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, before I forget, I have attorney Dale Minami coming up in May. Dale is a legendary social justice civil rights attorney. At a very young age, as a young attorney, he successfully fought in front of the Supreme Court the Fred Korematsu case, and they got it overturned, where he was thrown into prison because he refused to be drafted into World War II. This guy is a giant. And so I am really looking forward to having him. I found out that we were Facebook friends because he commented on something like, okay, I got to get this guy. So yeah, very excited about having him. If you want to get to my show, just look up Asian America. As soon as you type that in, the rest usually fills in on any of the apps that you would normally stream a podcast. Definitely iTunes, Spotify, although steer away from Spotify. Yeah, and the easiest, if you go to our website, that's where you can search based on topics. www.aapodcast.com is the easiest way to get to it. And it's all been redone in the last couple of months. You'll find Matthew's episode there with his smiling face that I took. Yeah. And we also put two other tools on there. Most popular. So if it's had at least 2,000 listens, then I'll go and I'll tag it as most popular. So you just hit the most popular button and you'll find out what most people listen to. And then highly recommended.
Oh, okay.
And I tagged, like your episode, highly recommended right out the gate. Okay. So even if it only had 10 listens, I felt like the conversation I had with you was noteworthy and I want people to find it. So that's another way. It's kind of like, it's like my own curated list beyond what's popular.
Got it. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot, actually. But yes, please go listen to Ken's podcast. It's great. And as you can see, he's a great speaker himself. So, but Ken, that's all I got for this podcast. Thank you so much. And I apologize for calling you a priest over email, not a pastor. But
that's okay. It's not your realm.
Not my realm at all. But thank you so much. And
my pleasure.
Hopefully we'll be able to work together or talk again soon.
Hope so.
Great. Thank you again to Ken Fong for jumping on the podcast and talking about his life, his story, about his podcast. Please go check out his podcast. It's great. He's had amazing guests. Go back and listen to the Kev Jumba episode. Go listen to my episode where he interviews me. Listen to all his guests. He has a great program going on over there. And I don't know if he writes his interview questions for everyone, but for me, he didn't write his interview questions, but he was still like an amazing interviewer. So he's really great at what he does. But if you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to our show for episodes that release on every other Tuesday and give us a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. If you would like to support our podcast and help us grow, you can do so with a donation to the link at the bottom of the episode description. To hear more about Changing Tides, follow us on Instagram at LTSC_Changing Tides, or check out our website, thechangingtides.org. Let's continue to change the tides on mental health. We got